Thanks so much for joining us for another riveting episode of Pantsuits and Lawsuits, your favorite podcast for hearing about the ongoing legal battles shaping this country.
I am Arizona Attorney General Kris Mays.
And I'm Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel.
And it's time to get started. Looking forward to this episode, Dana. We've got a good one ahead of us. Class is in session. We're going to be talking about the numerous really important lawsuits that we have filed against the administration in the education realm, where we have stood up for our educators and our students and higher education in this country.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's been a lot of them. Certainly, the Trump administration has a target on the back of educators and educational institutions all around the country. And it's not just K through 12, of course, it's universities as well, both public and private. And it's been a deep concern. Kris, can you walk us through our listeners through some of the cases that we filed just in these last few months?
Yeah, I think there have been several. I think you really have to start with our case to try to save the Department of Education. As folks know by now, the Trump administration essentially wanted to dismantle the Department of Education. They were attempting to fire many people inside DOE, Department of Education. They wanted to eliminate it, and what they were going to do would have eliminated incredibly important services and funding, like funding for Title I schools, which are low-income schools and kids who are low income and who need that extra funding. That also, by the way, would have impacted our rural schools here in Arizona, I'm sure in Michigan, terribly. Um, and then there's so many other things inside the Department of Education that would have been deeply impacted if they had been successful and in dismantling it. And, we obviously were successful in getting that stopped.
And actually, as of just today, we learned that the Department of Justice has appealed that case to the United States Supreme Court. So I guess stay tuned on that one.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. And, so far, certainly at the federal court level, the district court level, we have been pretty successful. And we're about to find out if the United States Supreme Court still believes in the separation of powers, which is really what undergirds a lot of these cases, right? Which is, if any president of either party wants to engage in this sort of wholesale disbanding of federal agencies that were essentially established by Congress, they need to go to Congress to get permission to do that.
Yeah, and they absolutely did not here. And I think it's fair to say they wouldn't have the votes had they tried,
Right.
even with Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate.
Yeah, and I think that's because pretty much everybody understands how important the Department of Education is to our states and to our rural communities and to our rural schools. When I talk to rural school superintendents, they tell me how important federal funding is for them. And so, we know that they would not succeed. I think another lawsuit that has been really important for us to win a preliminary injunction in, frankly, is the AmeriCorps lawsuit. We know a lot of AmeriCorps volunteers work in our school system. At least they do out here in our universities, at our universities, and they are critical. They're critical, for instance, in terms of us trying to increase our supply of teachers. We have a program at Northern Arizona University that teaches teachers and gets new teachers into our school system, where we have a critical shortage of teachers. So again, Trump tried to dismantle all of AmeriCorps without Congress's approval. And the impact on regular people in Arizona of that would have been just huge.
Yeah. And, I think about the ESSER funds case as well, that we have at least preliminarily had a lot of success on. And this is money that was allocated to public schools and school districts all around the country, and
Right.
it had to do with the response to COVID. And a lot of the schools took up the federal government on these grants to do things like to renovate HVAC systems and make sure they had proper heating and cooling systems in place, and many other upgrades that were desperately needed in schools all around the country. The school districts accepted, the proposals of these grants. I mean, they applied for it and were told they were going to receive this money in anticipation for that. They went out and they did some, major projects and spent, in some cases, for some school districts, millions of dollars, only for the Trump administration to then say, psych, you're not getting the money after all, even after they already spent it.
Yeah.
And now, but for us filing this case and so far being successful in this case, those school districts that are already badly underfunded would have to
Right.
find a way to make up what is sometimes millions of dollars. And they only spent that money because this offer was made to them by the federal government. And I think that just the cruelty of that, but also just, your federal government lying to you to your detriment in a way that, again, these schools don't have the money for that now. That money's been spent, those projects have been completed, and now it's time for the federal government to keep their promise, keep up their end of the contract, and pay up.
I mean, exactly. I mean, I think Arizonans and Michiganders in real life have to live up to their promises and to their contracts. I think we all understand that, but for some reason, the federal government right now thinks that it's okay to yank these funds and yank these contracts at the last minute, or even, as you said, even after the school districts have spent the money that was promised to them and in reliance on what was promised and offered. Out here, more than 90% of all of our students go to public schools that are already struggling under the burden of a legislature that will not properly fund them. We have massive teacher shortages in our school districts because we're not funding our teachers' salaries to the level, nearly to the level. I think in Arizona, I don't know where Michigan is. You're probably going to embarrass me here, but
Unlikely.
we're 49th or 50th, I think, in the country in teacher pay in that range. It's terrible. And to have these grants then yanked is just, heaps insult upon injury. And again, hurts ordinary Americans. That is the problem here and why we are fighting so hard. This is about really two things: upholding the rule of law and the Constitution and protecting everyday Michiganders and Arizonans.
Yeah, I take it so personally, the attacks on public education. Several things. Firstly, my parents were the children of immigrants that could neither read or write and had no formal education. And they relied on the Detroit public schools in order for them to better themselves in life. And my dad became an accountant. My mom became a public school teacher, a special ed teacher, and spent her career that way. And they could only do that because at the time we had really good public schools.
Yep.
And public schools are the great equalizer. And I look at, I mean, my public school education, which prepared me to become the top lawyer in a state of over 10 million people. And I think a lot about my kids who also are products of the public school system. But I think a lot about one of my sons who had a very significant learning disability.
Mm,
And he had an IEP.
mm.
Uh, and he had a teacher that just was totally devoted to him in elementary school. And she worked so hard. I mean, I was always told that my son would never learn to read, never learn to write.
Wow.
And he had a teacher who wouldn't give up on him. And so much so that she was diagnosed with stomach cancer when Zach was in the third grade. But she kept on coming to school over and over again, and it was midway through the fifth grade as my son was making a lot of advances, and it was clear that his teacher was not doing very well. And I learned later that it was recommended that she, you know, go on hospice at that point. And
Wow.
I said, Mrs. Petrus, why don't you go home? Spend some time with your family. And I'll never forget her saying shortly before she died that she wasn't ready to die until Zach had finished the fifth grade.
Oh,
And now my son just graduated from Michigan State University with a 4.0 grade point
that's
average.
amazing.
And he
Oh
was
my God.
never expected to even be able to make it through high school, let alone go to college. And that's the story of public education to me. It's Mrs. Petrus who was determined to make sure that my son and all the kids she taught could have a brighter future. And
Mhm.
that's why the villainizing and demonization of public school teachers really, I mean, it infuriates me because a public school education is so important, and it's the only thing that allows, people to advance when they come from circumstances that wouldn't otherwise allow them to. It's truly what makes America great, and it's unfortunate that Donald Trump and his administration can't and won't appreciate that.
Dana, that is just an amazing story, and boy, I mean that is such an amazing story, and but also probably the story that is replicated all across America with so many teachers who are dedicated. And honestly, I for in a lot of ways, I decided to run for attorney general, get back involved in politics after 10 years of being out of politics because of the way that I saw my daughter's teachers being treated, and the fact that they were not being supported. And I wanted to do everything that I could as Attorney General to support them. Like you, though, interestingly enough, my sister is a special education teacher in so your mom was, my sister is a sped teacher in California, and my mom was a teacher, public school teacher, and I too went to public schools, and my daughter's in public schools here in Arizona. So I think yeah, for all of those reasons, this is deeply personal. I think not just for us, but for the people of our state who deeply support the public school system, who deeply support our libraries. That's another one that we fought, the cuts to our library systems that we successfully are fighting against. And we are definitely not going to stop fighting to protect our public school system, as this administration continues to do, again, unconstitutional things that violate the rule of law.
Absolutely. Well, it's time to welcome our special guest.
It is.
Hi, Becky. Great to see you.
Hi, Dana. It's so good to see you. My goodness. Hi, Kris.
Hi, Becky. How you doing? Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Of course, of course. My goodness. Thank you. It is my honor. Um, wow, you guys have been busy.
We have. Well, we're
Yes, you
we're
have.
we're
Thank
trying, that's for sure.
Well, let's I know there's a lot to talk about. So I don't know if you do you want to kick things off, Kris, or
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, the Trump administration, as we know, is in the full throes of rampaging through our federal agencies right now, which really, we think, threatens to impede the education of our kids across America, especially K-12 classrooms, but also higher education as well. And as we, obviously, a lot of folks are on summer vacation right now, including my kiddo, but we're headed back into a fall session coming up. And to give us a better view of those consequences, we are so excited, Becky, that you are here, Becky Pringle from the NEA. So, Becky, gosh, can you just, I'd love to just have you get your get your reaction to what's going on right now in Washington, D.C.
But first, let me ask you this question. I
Yeah.
said to you during the first Trump administration, I don't think there could be a worse Secretary of Education than Betsy DeVos. But
And
All
I
you
right.
would know.
mean, how little we knew then. Like now, to the fact that me being from Michigan, that I now long for the days when Betsy DeVos was the Secretary of Education, really tells you how far we've fallen in such a short period of time.
I struggle to react to that. Obviously, you and I did a lot of work during that administration together to make sure that what you're doing right now, both of you. Let me start there first of all. I need to thank you on behalf of the 3 million members of the NEA and the 50 million students that we serve and the parents, millions of parents who just didn't know what to do January 20th. And right away, our attorneys generals across the country, the two of you in particular, stepped up and said, we will defend the rights of people. We will ensure that that this government functions. We will, in our own states, use our power, our voices, our ability to bring lawsuits against this government, this administration, let me say it that way, this administration, in ways that help to slow some things, allow us to bring light to some things for those who didn't necessarily know the full impact. So Attorney General Nessel, let me just say this, that we of course went through the years of Betsy DeVos being so obvious in trying to take money out of the public school system for herself and her billionaire buddies. It was so obvious what her game plan was. And she certainly road tested that in Michigan, right? So you knew and we knew and all of that. With Linda McMahon, I remember saying about Betsy DeVos, she's the most unqualified and all the things, right? Oh my. And now we have the WWE's are and putting the A1 sauce all over everything. What can I tell you? We can't talk about IDEA because she doesn't know what it is. So to say we've reached a new low is an understatement. But let me say this. You both know that I taught middle level students the wonders of science for 31 years. And as an educator for that long, before I became an officer of the NEA, I could talk to you about what the U.S. Department of Education meant for me as an educator and for my kids. And that's in part because I was a teacher for so long. And so, I've been on this earth for a minute if I taught for 31 years. And I know I was a part of it as a young person, the civil rights movement. And I saw as this country, wrestled with what was wrong about access and opportunities based on race. What happened with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and what continued to happen at the end of the late 60s and into the 70s, and ultimately kind of framed the important role that the federal government, the Department of Education at the federal level, had to play. Because we know that we have these systemic inequities that are built into every social system in this country, including education. And so the federal government had this role to play to make sure that our students with disabilities had the resources and access, to ensure that those students who come from low-income families, that we could help to kind of bridge some of those gaps, to ensure that we were addressing through the offices of civil rights in the Department of Education, the discriminatory practices that Black and Brown and Indigenous and AAPI students suffered throughout the country. And so I knew firsthand. I lived it. I know it. Not everyone knows, but I know the impact of trying to dismantle the Department of Education at a time when we know that our students, all of them, not just those who come from those communities that have been marginalized forever, but all our students will be impacted, rural, suburban, urban, by higher class sizes, which is what's going to happen, by the fact that we don't have educators because they're under attack all the time. The realities that will hit them are very evident to me as an educator and to more and more educators and parents and the students themselves.
But what do you say to people? And I hear this all the time. What do you say to the narrative that like we don't really need to have a federal Department of Education because that money will just go directly to the states and the states will better know how to handle and manage that money. So we don't need to have a DOE at all. How do you respond to that?
I have to believe the way the two of you respond. First of all, do you believe that? So let me just say that. Let's start there. We know what this is about. We know this is about finding money for tax breaks for people who are already obscenely rich enough. And so we know what's going to happen. But beyond that, let's just think about even if that money comes or some of it comes to the states, we know the impact of all of the other cuts are going to have on state budgets, where states are going to have to make decisions about whether or not they're going to fund education at the level that not only they're funding now, but the greater gaps that we're creating, whether we're talking about taking money out of Medicaid or other programs, SNAP, all of those programs are going to fall to the states. And the states are going to be in that place where they're going to have to make decisions that we know will impact public education in this country. And so, first of all, I'm not falling for that okie doke. Let's start there. And the second thing is that even if money comes to the state from the federal government, all of the other cuts that they are making will impact those state budgets.
Well, and I think, I mean, I share your theory there, Becky, on what's going to happen, what this is really about, because as you know, I am from a state that sadly has implemented universal vouchers. And we are now spending in Arizona $1 billion in taxpayer funds to largely pay for wealthy kids or the kids of wealthy parents to go to private schools or to be homeschooled. And that's what I think is going to happen here is I think this is really a scheme to privatize the Department of Education, to send the money putatively, I guess, to state departments of education, and then for them to create voucher programs or to do direct vouchers from the feds. I don't know which one it would be, but that's, I think, what their game is. And maybe it's just because I happen to live in a state where this has happened. And it's devastating and it drains funding from our public schools, which is where the vast majority of our students are educated.
There's just no question, Kris, that what you just said is exactly what's happening. And Arizona is such a good / bad example, right?
Yeah.
Because the vouchers have been there. So we already have evidence. What you just said, absolutely true. The money always goes, we pretended as though, oh, we're going to help Black and Brown students. That's what we're going to do. And that never happened. It never happened. This is now going on 3 decades. So it's not like we don't have evidence. And then, of course, the money automatically goes to those families that already have their students in private schools. And then what do? They raise their tuition.
Right. They just raise the tuition. That's all they're doing. They're getting the voucher money and then they're raising the tuition so that they can charge even more. It's just
charge even more.
Yeah.
So those families who could never afford it anyway, it's farther out of reach for them. The ones who could afford it, it doesn't matter. Right. And so here we are with that scheme in place. But what we also know what it does, right? It's draining money from the public schools year after year after year, and making it harder for states like yours to adequately, that's not even the right word, but to fund your public schools. And we've seen it over and over again. And then let's go back, Kris. Something you said to me just now made me think about this too, because we've already seen this happen. So even if the federal government reluctantly sends the money to the states, we already know strings are going to be attached. We already know that. So if you are not complying with what we're saying about DEI, then we're not sending it to you. Or we might say we're going to send it to you and we don't, because we found something out. You're teaching something, the true history of this country, for example. Or you're not teaching something like the 2020 election was stolen.
You're definitely not teaching about the Tulsa race riots. I'm going to tell you that right now. That
And
100% is not going to be taught.
no, absolutely not. So they might say they're giving you the money, but just what happened right now? I mean, the money that has been promised already to the states. Right now, our schools are being impacted, which I always try to make that point. But then when you opened up, we absolutely have to concern ourselves with what's going to happen in a month or so when our kids start to go back to school. Or Kris, I think you said that. So, but right now, schools are not getting the money that was promised to them. I was just in a district in East St. Louis in Illinois, where they were using their ARPA funds to put in HVAC systems. And I want to say, who knew about HVAC systems before the pandemic? Who was talking about that? Now, we did. We had always been sounding those alarms that our air filtration system is not safe, or those kids were more prone to get asthma and all of the things that predispose them to get sick from COVID or die from COVID. But now everybody knows about it, right? It's 2025.
Right.
And we have a school district that still didn't have the resources to put in an HVAC system. And now they have finally planned to do it this spring. And that money was yanked away from them. That was already promised to them. So these things are already happening. That is the impact of this Trump administration on our kids and our communities, our parents, this country.
I want to bring up something kind of interesting that was a case that actually we were involved in Michigan that at the time was called the Gary B case. And it seems like a million years ago now, but the arguments that were made by these kids who were in the Detroit public school system, that at the time there was an emergency manager that from our former Republican governor Rick Snyder had basically taken over the school district, but then, not used it in a way where they had proper, teachers and the schools, were literally falling apart. And they, to your point, they were freezing cold or they were really hot in the spring or summer. And, part of the arguments we made were that this was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment to deprive children of just minimal levels of education in reading and writing and math. And we connected a public school education, a good, decent public school education, to the preservation of democracy. Because if kids are not being taught to read and write, they are unlikely to vote. And to me, that's part of the plan. And then the other thing about it is this. Kids who don't have a proper education also are much more likely to buy into conspiracy theories. And they're more likely to be intolerant of people who aren't exactly like themselves. And so I think we're seeing the fruition of that. We oddly, we won this case at the Sixth Circuit, if you can believe it. But then en banc, the decision was vacated, which was very unfortunate. But I only say that because there is this direct correlation, is there not, between our ability to maintain a democracy and people being properly educated?
Honestly, they could not have said that better. My dad was a history teacher. He had 3 girls, and he would always make us sit down and listen. Rebecca, that's what he called me when he was really mad or very serious. Rebecca, you need to understand your history, your family history, Black history, which is American history, and world history. You need to understand. And one of the lessons he taught us, I reluctantly, science. I didn't care about history. Well, now, of course. I wish he were here to talk to. And But he would always talk about you could follow the trajectory of a society, a government, reign, no matter where you were in the world. Throughout time, you could follow it. When it was on its rise and when it was on its fall. And when you saw it was falling. It was you could see universally those who were in positions of power taking away the right of its citizens to learn. And what's happening now? That's happening in our country, which is shocking that we're dealing with book bans and censoring curriculum and retelling or leaving vast parts of history out of what's being taught. And all of it is designed for what you just said, Dana. I mean, we have to acknowledge that. Public education, universal free quality education for everyone, is the foundation of our democracy, any democracy. And when you don't have that, or it's unequal, inequitable, then you know what you described is exactly what will happen. And so not only do we appreciate that you take that up from a legal perspective, and regardless of the ruling being vacated, we need to continue to do it. As I said earlier, we have to slow it where we can. We have to lift it up and make the connections that you just made, which are so important. If our students don't have the critical thinking skills, if they can't collaboratively problem solve, if they don't have the windows, if they don't have the mirrors to see themselves and the windows to see each other, then we cannot operate our democracy cannot operate the way democracy should, where you have people who are taking ownership and responsibility for participation and understand what that civic duty is, and are able to make decisions, to discern the discernment that you talked about, between lies and the truth. All of that is on the line right now, and it is deliberate. It is deliberate. We see it as it's proliferating across other states. We know it because we know that at the end of the day, that's what they see as a block. An educated citizenry is a block to their march toward unfettered power. That's what's happening.
So Becky, one of the things that Dana and I were talking about in the introduction to this segment was the impact of all of these proposed cuts by the Trump administration to rural schools, something I'm really worried about here in Arizona, and I know Dana is too. And and that's because, what any rural school superintendent will tell you is that they rely on probably these federal funds, maybe even more than any other school district, because their property tax base is lower. They don't bring in as many sort of funds from the sort of normal usual routes that urban school districts can, and the wealthier school districts, at least in Arizona. So can you speak to, what the demolition of the Department of Education would mean, really for all of our schools, but low income schools and rural schools? What would be the on the ground impact of that?
Actually,
And special, kids who are special needs, and getting, IEPs, those types of things.
so I don't think I've used the word demolition the way you just used it, but I think I will, because it was like a visual you just created by your.
And it's also true. That's what they
It's
want to do,
true,
right?
but it was like a visceral reaction when you used that word. But it's true, right? And thank you for lifting up rural, and certainly I've visited rural areas in Michigan. And so of course it's true in Michigan. I'm from Pennsylvania, and people who aren't in Pennsylvania think of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So they don't think rural, but we're one of the most rural states there is in the nation. So I know firsthand the impact, and it's not. I forget how you just said it, but no, it's not. We have the numbers to prove that what you have said about the percentage of money that goes to rural schools from the federal government is outsized, because of course they don't have the tax base. tax base. That's part of the inequitable
Right.
funding of public
Yeah.
education in this country. And that same thing could be said of some urban areas and where they're from, and you know where they are. But
Right.
the rural areas depend on the federal government in so many ways. I mean, all of which impact education, right? So we could talk about hospitals or the lack of them,
Right.
medical care, all those things. If our kids aren't healthy, they can't come to school ready to learn every day. We could talk about food deserts. We could talk about all of that. And it's our federal government that steps in the gaps for our rural families in ways that honestly, Kris, they don't know. And it's part of what we have to talk about and lift up those real voices. But I will tell you, we have some, you know, there's a lot of things about the election, but one thing that's not lifted up as much, and I try to do that all the time, is that, you know, the voters do not agree with vouchers and voucher schemes. They don't agree. They vote against it whenever they're given the chance to. But
Right.
elected leaders aren't listening to them. But I tell you what, Kentucky, every one of their 120 counties voted against vouchers.
Wow.
And how rural, every one, 120.
Wow.
You know how rural and red those counties are.
Yep.
But it's because they understood, wait a minute, you're coming, wait a minute, you're trying to take money from my public school. I can't benefit from whatever you're talking about. And I know it. That I am gonna be harmed. My child is gonna be harmed. So those are the kinds of things we need to talk more about and have those families and those students and those educators teaching in those schools talk about the impact of those federal dollars, not just literally to education, but to everything that impacts our families' health, which impacts our children, ability to have housing, all the things that ultimately for us as educators lands at our schoolhouse door, and whether they're ready to learn when they come into our classrooms every day. So you're absolutely right. Please keep lifting that up.
I have a question. You know, one of the earlier executive orders that came down from Donald Trump's magical Sharpie really threatened the prosecution of teachers who radically indoctrinated their students. No definition provided of that. And I know that for me, you know, I went and I put out a statement and I did a video directed at our public school teachers specifically saying, just so you know, please don't be afraid that law enforcement is going to like, you know, bust down your classroom door because you had the audacity to teach, you know, To Kill a Mockingbird to your students, which is on the list of banned books I notice in many places now. Ironically, that's the only reason I became a lawyer is because I read that book. I was so inspired by it. But that being the case, you know, I put out a statement basically like sort of reminding people of Civics 101. Like, here is how criminal statutes are formulated. It takes in, you know, for a federal law, it's got to be, you know, the House, the Senate, signed off on by the president. If it is a state law, same, state house and Senate, signed by the governor. That's how you create a criminal statute, not through an executive order. But one of the things that concerns me is this threat to school teachers, for them to be concerned 24/7 about like, is the federal government going to come after me if I'm teaching in accordance with our school district's curriculum? What do you say to teachers out there that are afraid every day to go to work, and people who don't even want to stay in the profession because they're so concerned about it?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. We talked about you doing that kind of a video. So I appreciate that you did that. That was fabulous. And one of the things that we started from the beginning, we started this before the Trump administration came in place, but now we've obviously updated, ramped it up, and all of the things. Is know your rights. And so what you did in terms of knowing and understanding the process so that our educators can feel safe to do what's right. So let's start there. But to the point you raised, which then a lot of people don't know, that our educators are teaching the curriculum that was adopted. That's what they're doing. And when they are under attack that's part of what we are making sure that they are grounded in. As a union, of course, we're defending any violation of that. And we've won those cases where for whatever reason, the powers that be got involved in an educator teaching the true history of this country, or teaching a book that was on the list for them to teach. But the reality is we have to make sure that more and more of our educators know that, and others. But beyond that, I want you to imagine, and I'm going back to, just teaching. Even when I started, it's a hard job to do. We have so many things. Whenever I talk about my teaching, I always say I taught students. And I say that deliberately. I didn't teach science. I taught students the wonders of science. Because I knew that when Sade came in 2 days a week, and I'm talking away about the three laws of motion, and she missed something and she's not making the connection, I had to understand why she was only coming to school 2 days a week. And I found out that she had 7 siblings. She was 12. That she had to babysit because her parents couldn't get care for those kids. And she was the oldest, she was responsible. And so I had to factor that into, okay, how do I get to this child? As a teacher, I had to spend time trying to access resources for Sade, all of these things, not just teach about the 3 laws of motion. I had to teach Sade. And so when we think about fast forward now, not only do all teachers have to do that anyway, that's always been true, but now they're under attack. So what you rightly brought into this conversation, the struggle we are having at a time when we know that we have an educator shortage, that in addition to all they always have to do, now you're putting that on them, that fear that they're going to get in trouble, or just the disrespect of them as professionals. And they're disrespecting them and not paying them. So yeah, how do we attract, let alone retain, educators in classrooms? That's one of the reasons why I say, everybody's going to be affected by this. Whether you will happen to be in that marginalized group or not, those class sizes are going to soar. You're not going to have access to career and technical training at the level you did. You're not going to have the student loans or access to help to get through the student loan process that the Department of Education provides. Everybody's going to be impacted by what this administration has done. And when we go back to school, that impact, it's already happening, but that impact will grow larger as our students with disabilities don't have the paraprofessionals that help them get through that day and learn those lessons. And those are the stories that we are using. In fact, we use those stories in the suit that the NEA filed in collaboration with the ACLU. Those real stories. So we made that through line that you just made, Dana, between what this government, this Trump administration is doing and the direct impact on the violation of the rights or ability to learn for our students.
Yeah, and Becky, you make such an important point, which is that our schools increasingly are places that provide so many services to kids. I recently learned, I didn't even know this, but in Arizona, we have some school nurses that are providing Medicaid funded services to kids at school. So when the Medicaid cuts come down, some of our school nurses may not be able to provide some of those health care services to kids that they so desperately need. And that's just another example. There's so many areas that sort of are centered around our schools that are going to be harmed. And again, these are average, everyday Michiganders and Arizonans and Americans who are going to be hurt by these cuts, these frankly cruel and totally unnecessary cuts at a time when we need to not be cutting, we should be increasing funding to our schools.
Well, I know we have to wrap this up, but I just want to tell you a story, and that's that a few weeks ago I did a town hall that was actually in my hometown that I grew up in West Bloomfield, Michigan. And at the end of the town hall, this lady kind of rushed the stage, which I'm glad my detail didn't take her out. But this, whatever, 80-something-year-old woman, and ran up and hugged me. And I looked up, and it was Mrs. Chudnoff, my fifth grade teacher from Roosevelt Elementary School. And I just I looked at it and I thought to myself, I remember her so well because she made such an impact on me. I remember all my teachers. And I just hope that the message is loud and clear to all of the teachers across America that you represent, that, there are so many Mrs. Chudnoffs out there that after all these years, I mean, I'm like 112 now, I think. I was only 15 before the second Trump administration. But I mean, we remember our teachers because they had such a positive impact on our lives. And so I hope that the teachers you represent, the educators you represent, will know and understand, no matter how much the Trump administration and no matter how much this wrestling lady try to villainize teachers, they still continue to be some of the most important and influential people in the lives of these kids, and will be for the rest of their lives, no matter how old they get. And I hope that they will keep on doing exactly what they've been doing for so many years, and that is changing the lives of American children for the better.
Oh, thank you for sharing that story, Dana. Just a couple of things, Kris, and both of you, please keep lifting up examples like the one you just lifted up about the direct connection between Medicaid cuts and cuts to personnel. And we're doing that too, right at the outset, like February, when the research grants were cut, and people didn't make that direct tie either. We have special education teachers whose salaries are paid from research grants because they're doing research into the best teaching methods for our students with disabilities. And so they were gone on Monday, gone. And people don't know those stories. So the direct ties from other money to whether or not those people are there, please continue to do that. Dana, thank you for sharing that story. I have been saying everywhere, at the end of every interview I do, if the reporter says, do you have anything else you want to say? Yes, I do. And I always say I've never been prouder to call myself a teacher than I am right now. As I visited Dana, I think it's been 2 years, I'm trying to think, when we were together in the schools there in Michigan, and I saw what the teachers and administrators and parents and the school board members, remember, it was everybody together, right? And they understood their shared responsibility. It's a whole student, and the program they had in place, if you recall, around making sure that all of the students they had a place to go where they could feel safe. It wasn't just for students that were getting in trouble. They made it available to all the students because they knew how important it was, that social emotional development and nurturing and all of that, how important that was to their learning, especially with us coming out of COVID. And so the role you play, I can't underestimate it. Please continue to visit our schools and talk to educators and to parents and our students. Please continue to use your brilliance to make those connections and slow things down in the way that you have done. On behalf of all of our educators, I just can't thank you enough. Thank you.
We will do it. We promise you, Becky. And thank you so much again. And to paraphrase Henry Adams, it's our teachers who affect eternity. So we will keep fighting to make sure our teachers can affect eternity. Thank you, Becky Pringle. Thank you, Becky Pringle from the NEA for fighting for our students in America. Thanks for coming on our podcast.
Thanks.
Well, Saved by the Bell, that is all the time that we have on today's episode of Pantsuits and Lawsuits.
Thank you so much for listening and for being lifelong learners. We'll be back with another episode about the latest and greatest in American jurisprudence very soon.
And please do not forget to follow us on social media, subscribe, and also check out our websites for timely updates on the work of both of our departments.
That's right. But for now, it's time for me and Kris to hit the books.
Get back to work. Hey, everybody, don't forget to catch Pantsuits and Lawsuits wherever you get your podcasts.